The First Tyrannic War was a series of conflicts fought primarily by the Imperium against the Tyranid Hive Fleet Behemoth, beginning in late M41. This conflict marked the beginning of the Tyrannic Wars and was the first formal armed conflict with the Great Devourer, although there is evidence that Imperial forces had unknowingly fought the species before this date. Apart from the immense military cost, this war served as first contact, and Imperial efforts during it were pivotal in both understanding the xenobiology of the new race and in realizing the gravity of what they were dealing with. Over the course of the invasion, many minor races were rendered extinct, and thousands of planets had been reduced to lifeless husks, drained of their biomass. The story of the First Tyrannic War begins in the 730s of M41, on a remote research planet known as Tyran, in the fringes of the Ultima Segmentum. Tyran was a seemingly unimportant ocean world, about 60,000 light-years from Terra. The outpost on Tyran Primus was built deep in the ruins of an ancient chain of volcanic islands. The base was well protected, already fortified against the extreme storms and dangerous sea creatures of Tyran, and given enough defenses to stand against any pirates or aggressive aliens known to be on the edge of known space. It also boasted 4 giant defense lasers protected by hardened ceramite and void shield generators. In turn, these emplacements were further defended by over 3 dozen autocannon and lascannon interceptors and their corresponding bastions and Proteus-class bunkers. Further complementing the ground defenses was a full regiment of Imperial Guard troops, including veterans from Katachan, backed up by the Skitarii bodyguard of Magos Varnak, the outpost's commander. Up in space, Tyran was protected by 3 Endeavour light cruisers and 3 full wings of Thunderbolt fighters. All this was the standard defense design for an Imperial outpost on the frontier and had proven itself against countless local threats. As regular duties were carried out planet-side, an anomaly was discovered in local space when local Imperial explorators in the preceding decade undertook a census of the planetary systems surrounding Tyran. They found that several planets previously reported to have been habitable were now lifeless, barren rock without even any living bacteria. These mysterious new dead worlds were a cause of unease and reported to the Explorator General, but nothing came of it. Later, the Tyran outpost itself filed its own reports of discovered dead worlds, but once again, no help was sent. Magos Varnak was undertaking a survey of nearby worlds when a massive cloud of unidentified objects entered the system. Varnak, his ship having been damaged by strange, fleshy mines on the edges of the cloud, managed to return to Tyran Primus. Less than a week later, the invasion of Tyran began. Bioships were hurled against fire from the outpost's defense lasers for over an hour. But then suddenly, the invaders withdrew. Varnak ordered his small fleet to immediately chase the fleeing vessels. However, after breaking through the spore cloud that masked the Tyranid fleet, Varnak discovered that fewer than a dozen alien ships had been destroyed in the initial assault, out of a fleet of several thousand. The Tyranid fleet then changed course and annihilated all the Imperial cruisers that had been drawn away from the planet. Returning to Tyran, the Tyranids launched thousands of mycetic spores into the sea around Tyran Primus. The base's astropath was unable to broadcast for help as the aliens somehow disrupted the warp, through what later became known as the shadow in the warp. At first, the stationed Imperial Guard held back the attackers with volleys of disciplined las fire, but eventually, parts of the defense network were destroyed, allowing ever more spores to reach the surface and unleash more Tyranid creatures. Soon, the bastions were overrun, the defense laser complexes lost, and the Tyran Primus outpost swamped by invading aliens. The command bunker held out as the last secure location. As the adamantium gate of the bunker caved in and Hormagaunts rushed in, Varnak pressed a switch, sending a data codex containing recordings of what had befallen Tyran, plummeting into the depths below the base. His data codex contained a final message, warning mankind of what awaited them.
We cannot live through this. Mankind cannot live through this. In a single day, they have covered this planet with a flood of living blades and needle-fanged mouths. Kill 1 and 10 take its place. If they are truly without number, then our race is doomed to a violent death before every shred of our civilization is scoured away by a force more voracious than the fires of hell themselves. Death by the machine god. Death is here.
Almost a year later, the data codex was found by Inquisitor Cryptman, a far-sighted Ordo Xenos Inquisitor who was examining the Explorator reports as part of his investigation of a new, unexplained wave of dead worlds. He had identified a pattern encroaching into the galaxy and ventured to the desolate planets himself, looking for proof. When he arrived at Tyran, he discovered the entire planet, once an ocean world, sucked utterly dry and devoid of any vegetation or life. The planet had been reduced to a dead world. After the planet Tyran, he gave the new alien threat the designation Tyranids. However, Tyran was only the beginning. As Cryptman hurriedly fell back to notify Sector Imperial forces, Behemoth continued its slow crawl forward. They attacked Oculus, a moon-sized observatory station, as they pushed closer towards formal Imperial borders. The station was a bio-artifact, claimed by the Imperium 9,000 years earlier, and was devoured along with its crew. After this, the fleet had its first observed contact with another Xenos species when it assaulted the planet Jagger. Jagger was the home to orc freebooters, known as the Star Krumpas, and was known for its dangerous moon bison hordes. Having previously participated in the Second War for Armageddon under Gazkul, the Greenskins had troubled local Imperial forces for some time. Their considerable kill cruiser fleet, once the major threat to local shipping, put up a great fight against Behemoth, but was eventually destroyed. With its destruction, the orc population was devoured, rendering the planet a dead world. Cryptman desperately raced to the Thandros system, Hive Fleet close behind. Though remote, Thandros was a rather developed system, boasting the twin mining worlds Thandros 2 and 3 and a telepathica matrix that orbited Thandros 1, which boosted astropathic signals and allowed long-range communications. Cryptman had previously sent off his reports to the system to be broadcasted, but had not been answered. Arriving himself, he entered orbit of Thandros 1 and found it destroyed, with its matrix magazines empty and its laser banks burnt out. No help had arrived for the feebly defended system, as the shadow in the warp blocked any of their pleas. The workers of Thandros 2 and Thandros 3 had been slaughtered in their own dark, labyrinthine mines, as a swarmlord cleared out any resistance. A desperate Cryptman barely managed to salvage the Matrix so it could project the valuable data codex that chronicled the Tyranid invasion of Tyran, along with his own report. The report successfully found its way to the Ordo Xenos, who notified Imperial forces and replied with orders to travel to Macragge and assist in mounting a defense against the Xenos fleet. With the Imperium finally aware, Cryptman began the long journey to the homeworld of the Ultramarines. As the forces of Ultramar began to create a proper rampart, a small Imperial crusade was mustered. This counterattack was known as the Lacrima Doarosa Crusade and targeted the system of its namesake. It served as a fact-finding mission against the newly arrived Tyranids, hoping to gain intelligence that was critically needed for a proper Imperial defense. The Imperial forces of this crusade were composed of companies from the Space Wolves, Blood Angels, Ultramarines, Blood Drinkers, and the entire Imperial Fists chapter. Along with the chapter's accompanying battle fleets, a number of battleships from the Imperial Navy also took part in the crusade. When they reached the Lacrima Doarosa system, located in the eastern side of Ultima Segmentum, the Crusade's forces were confronted by thousands of bioships, though they appeared inert. Several, though, were close to the orbit of the Imperial feral jungle world Lacrima Doarosa III. It was these bioships that were targeted by the Space Marines, with each chapter choosing specific ships for their forces' boarding torpedoes to strike at. When the Space Marines invaded, they were confronted not only by the bioships' strange, fleshy interiors, but also by various previously unencountered Tyranid organisms. Luck was with them, however, as the Tyranids were only slowly awakening to the Space Marines' presence. A 30-man portion of the Imperial Fists, Captain Hellstrom's 90-member strike force, led by the Lieutenant von Reuter, advanced. They continued into the ship until the Marine Dolph Harlan accidentally fell into a teleporter worm. Though they did not know what it was at the time, the Imperial Fists soon discovered its purpose after they could not see Harlan or contact him in any way. Von Reuter's group then sent a sensor down to try and locate Harlan, but it disappeared as well. This, though, caused the worm to expel a deceased armored Xenos body, which had 2 arms, 2 crab-like legs, and a turtle-shaped head. To their amazement, their devices estimated the body to be 14,000 years, plus or minus 2,000. Von Reuter then theorized that the Xenos had entered the bioship in the galaxy the Tyranids had originally been in. They did not think on this long, and von Reuter took the Xenos' ceramic gun, before the Imperial Fists placed choke grenades on the body and placed it back into the teleporter worm. They had hoped the grenades would cause the worm to return Harlan, but their efforts failed and they were forced to move on. They then were shocked to encounter gene stealers, who were previously considered a dangerous Xenos oddity, and realized that the entire species was somehow tied to the Tyranids. After slaying the gene stealers, von Reuter then gave the order to move further into the bioship. Since their main goal was fact-finding, von Reuter had hoped that by doing so, they would find and then destroy the organism that controlled the bioship. To cover more ground, he split his forces into 2 groups. The groups then went their separate ways. Von Reuter's group was shocked even further when they were attacked by creatures that were a mixture of Orc and Tyranid DNA. The Astartes realized that the Orcs on Jagger were not simply consumed, but had had their DNA stolen and repurposed as well. Though they suffered losses, the team killed the creatures, and an incensed von Reuter reported the information to his chapter. He also warned the other invading Space Marine groups not to leave their dead behind, lest the Tyranids absorb their DNA and unleash horrible new hybrid creatures against the Imperium. As they ventured further, Lieutenant von Reuter's concerns grew as his group encountered humans mixed with Tyranid DNA. Unlike the Orc hybrids, however, these humans had been turned into mobile searchlights, which appeared to aid in awakening the sleeping Tyranids. After killing these hybrids, though, they were confronted by a Xenos called a Zoat, who stated it was an ambassador for the Tyranids' ruling hive mind. The Zoat claimed the hive mind was aware of the threat the Chaos Gods posed to mankind, and if mankind agreed to join the Tyranids, they would no longer fear the creatures of the warp. the hive mind would remake mankind's flesh and minds into new forms to serve the Tyranids, and in doing so, it would remove the chaos taint that had been written into the human species. This would deprive the chaos gods of their nourishment, which the hive mind ensured the Imperial fists would extinguish them for good. The Zote even boasted that the missing Lamenter's chapter had already joined the hive mind's crusade against the chaos gods. The enraptured Imperial fists stood calmly listening, and although the group knew they should not believe the Zote's words, they could not help themselves. It was as if the Zote's hypnotic voice held them in its sway. The Xenos then offered to allow itself to be taken prisoner and asked to be taken back to the Phalanx. Once there, the Zote would share the hive mind's plans for mankind with the entire Imperial Fists chapter. While some argued against this, many of von Reuter's group were under the Zote's psychic power and claimed they should retreat with the Zote. However, Biff Tundrish was able to resist the Zote and confronted the Xenos ambassador. He stated that the Zote was merely stalling the group in order to allow other Tyranid creatures to gather in overwhelming numbers to kill them. Biff hit at the truth of the matter, and in an instant, the calm Zote turned into a raging beast and attacked him. In mere seconds, the Zote decapitated Biff, killed Brother Kurtz, and mauled Lieutenant von Reuter. Before von Reuter could be killed, though, the surviving Imperial fists opened fire and slaughtered the Zote. Von Reuter, however, had been severely wounded and had lost an arm as well. He was unable to continue, and Sergeant Duron took command. As they then took stock of the situation, the group theorized they must be close to their goal due to the Zote's reaction. After Duron reported the incident with the Xenos ambassador to the chapter, the group began to move out. They would need to leave the lieutenant behind, but swore they would come back for him after they located and destroyed the bioship's controlling organism. However, they were soon confronted by 6 Tyranid warriors who barred their path. The battle brother Alexandro Darquibus appeared ready to be the first to attack, which led his comrade Jeremy Valance to intervene. He knew his brother would be killed if he attacked, and so Valance grabbed Sergeant Duron's power sword and charged the Tyranid warriors. He told the others to escape, as he kept the warriors occupied on himself. The sergeant did not do so at first, but gave the order to retreat after one of the Tyranid warriors began piercing Valance's skull with its claws. Though he died soon afterwards, Valance did so, knowing he had protected Darquibus. Duron's surviving group, meanwhile, had received orders to retreat, as the crusade was coming to a close. When they returned for von Reuter, though, they discovered the lieutenant was dead and being feasted upon by small Tyranid scavengers. The group killed them, and Battle Brother Mahler was able to recover von Reuter's gene seed. This was not the case for Biff Tundrish, whose body had been nearly consumed by beetles. Sergeant Duron would burn them and Biff's body before successfully leading the group back to their extraction point, while planting explosives along the way. Of the 90 Imperial Fists who had boarded the bioship, 61 survived to return to their chapter. As the boarding torpedoes returned to their ships, the Hive Fleet within the Lacrima Doarosa system became active. With the veil of secrecy broken, the Imperial Navy's battleships opened fire, pouring vast munitions onto the fleet and destroying many of its bioships. But the Hive Fleet numbered in the thousands, and while the Crusades combined might destroyed about 1/5 of the bioships, there was no hope of destroying them all. Nor was there any hope of saving Lacrima Doarosa III or its people. That had never been the purpose of the Crusade, however, and once the Space Marines had been retrieved, the Crusade's forces departed the system. Soon afterwards, the Hive Fleet fell upon the world, consuming its population. The world was considered a small loss, though, compared to the great success the Lacrima Doarosa crusade had achieved. Thanks to the Space Marines' efforts and the specimens they returned with, the Imperium knew more about the workings of the Tyranid Hive Fleet. It also became aware of the Gene Stealers and Zot's connection to the Tyranids, as well as their ability to create orc and human hybrid organisms. Meanwhile, Behemoth continued to press forward and finally assaulted former Imperial borders at the edge of Ultramar. Here it landed upon the planet of Prandium, known as the Jewel in Ultramar's crown, and found an easy victory. Here the Ultramarines mounted a defense of the planet in support of the local Prandium Defense Auxilia under commanders such as Cyrus Falili. However, the Imperials failed to defend the world, and after the Astartes and PDF forces were slain, the luscious agri-world was stripped of all life. The Tyranids were so thorough that even Prandium's atmosphere was consumed for whatever biomass it contained. This devastating defeat sent shocks through the Ultramarine chapter. For a week, Marneus Calgar went without food or water while meditating on the matter. When he came out of his trance-like state, he told the Ultramarines that they had been guilty of the sin of pride and that they would have to adapt and develop new strategies and tactics, even weapons. With this, they began restructuring their entire tactical arsenal. Hit-and-run raids were abandoned in place of concentrated defenses and static firepower. They could not afford to whittle away at Behemoth, as it grew stronger after even its most Pyrrhic victories. Instead, decisive and total victories were required to repel the Xenos. This meant that the Ultramarines had to choose a critical hardpoint to defend, and they chose their fortress monastery on Macragge. As the Astartes prepared their ultimate defense line, Behemoth too was being forced to adapt to the peculiarities of this new galaxy. A tendril pressing south arrived at Solemnus, none other than the home of Trazyn the Infinite. This tomb world museum of the Nihilak dynasty boasted exceptional defenses, as well as a peculiar lack of biomass. As such, the tendril steered clear, hoping to avoid conflict with the Necrons. Unfortunately for it though, the surrounding Necron sector was similarly devoid of life, and after searching for food long enough, the tendril was forced to enter hibernation and awaited nutrient reinforcement. As the main fleet pressed onward, it also unknowingly stumbled across Chaos forces. As Behemoth went to absorb the fortress world of Sibari, it found that it served as the secret stronghold for the Death Shadows renegade Astartes chapter. Here the Death Shadows were quietly preparing resources for a massive assault on Ultramar. Their plans were cut short as the Hive Fleet ripped them apart for biomass. As a final oddity, Behemoth also came across another new species of Xenos when a fragment of Behemoth moved to consume the Eldari maiden world of Shao Yor. Craft world Biel-Tan unleashed the engines of Vol in its defense. The pristine surface of Shao Yor played host to a titanic clash of towering biomonstrosities and graceful Eldari grav-tanks. Stalking through the carnage came the Tyrannifex that the Eldari named the Bane of Shao Yor, its colossal biocannon obliterating enemy vehicles with every peristaltic blast. Their losses mounting, the warriors of Biel-Tan eventually were forced to retreat. With great sadness, Shao Yor was consumed by the Great Devourer. After enough advancing, Behemoth's main prong finally arrived at the hard Imperial line on Macragge. The planet was both the Ultramarine fortress monastery as well as the political capital of the realms of Ultramar. A place of great importance for all Ultramarine successors, Calgar had mustered most of the Ultramarine chapter for its defense. If the world was to fall, Behemoth would be unable to be repelled for a considerable distance. With this titanic gathering of forces, the battle for Macragge commenced. Having been forewarned of the impending Tyranid attack by Inquisitor Cryptman, the Ultramarines had fortified their homeworld's already formidable defenses. Above Macragge, the Ultramarines marshaled an enormous battle fleet, including Star Nova-class orbital weapon stations, dozens of warships, the Ultramarines' mighty battle barges, heavy cruisers of the Ultramar Defense Fleet, a ragtag collection of lightly armed merchantmen and privateers, and the requisition of every single space-worthy vessel fit for combat. Meanwhile, a series of defenses were carefully constructed on the ground. If the Tyranids could not be stopped in orbit, Calgar's plan was for the defenders to fall back to the planet's polar fortresses and hold out until reinforcements arrived. With the battle lines drawn, Behemoth finally arrived. An inconceivable mass of biological starships were detected streaming into the system's borders. The Tyranids, upon arriving in the system, were not daunted in the least by the tremendous defenses, and without delay launched their assault. The defenders blew apart countless waves of bio-vessels as they sped towards the planet. But with every wave, more and more mycetic spores managed to break through to the planet's surface. As the Tyranid creatures made planetfall, the land battle began. Calgar divided his forces into three armies. The primary and secondary task forces, composed of most of the First Company and Ultramar planetary defense forces, bolstered the polar fortresses on the north and south poles of the planet, whilst Calgar led the largest task force, composed of the entire Second Company plus elements of the 1st, 5th, and 10th Companies, in a series of rearguard attacks to attempt to slow the Tyranid onslaught and buy time for the First Company to further fortify the polar fortresses. At first, the Ultramarines slowed the Tyranid advance for some time. But even under Calgar's incredible leadership, the Imperial forces were only delaying the inevitable oncoming horde, and eventually Calgar made the decision to withdraw his forces further north. At the same time, the Sirocco starport was infiltrated by gene stealers, which destroyed much of Calgar's shuttle fleet along with its pilots and auxiliary defenders. Having lost the bulk of his auxiliary forces, but still needing to slow down the oncoming horde, Calgar set himself to making a stand at Cold Steel Ridge. Cold Steel Ridge was an industrial complex on the frozen northern seas of Macragge. It was home to a company of defense auxilia that were reinforced by a Baneblade tank, the Pride of Hera. The hive mind had by this point identified Calgar as the main threat to the Tyranid advance. The Swarm Lord, the hive mind's deadliest servant, was dispatched to deal with him. The arrival of this unique beast was the turning point of the battle. Imperial forces had just begun to adjust to the brutal and mindless slog of Tyranid advance, but with the arrival of this higher Tyranid organism, the lesser beasts became much more intelligent. No longer were they feral animals, but beasts of war, being commanded by a biological automaton of immense intellect. The defenders' left flank was suddenly assaulted by tunneling raveners, which only served as a diversion to lead the Ultramarines away from the Swarm Lord's true target, the Pride of Hera. The Baneblade was left wide open for a wave of Carnifexes to rip it apart. Calgar watched as his enemy's tactics unfolded. Gargoyles and harpies preyed upon officers and sergeants of the auxiliary units. Biovores bombarded the defenders and forced them to spread out to minimize casualties, but this in turn left them vulnerable to Morlock and Trigon attacks. The Ultramarines reacted to each threat with valor and bolstered weakened sections of their line. However, they were outnumbered and outmatched. Then the Swarm Lord, with a bodyguard of Tyrant Guard and Tyranid warriors, bellowed a challenge to Calgar and charged directly towards his position. The Ultramarines rushed to aid their chapter master, but even this movement was planned for by the Swarm Lord. Hundreds of apparently dead Hormagaunts, strewn across the ground, leapt to sudden life and bogged down the Space Marines, delaying them from reaching Calgar. The Ultramarines' honor guard could not stop the Swarm Lord from rending, tearing, and gravely wounding Calgar. However, just in time, Ultramarine Thunderhawk gunships arrived from orbit and blasted the Tyranids back to clear enough room to land and evacuate the survivors. Commander of the Guard Aloysius held back the Swarm Lord and its attending Tyrant Guard as the rest of the Honor Guard helped Calgar to safety. Just as Aloysius fell to the Swarm Lord's blades, the Thunderhawks lifted off to return to the battle barge Octavius in orbit above Macragge. Cold Steel Ridge was taken by the Tyranids, leaving the path to the northern polar fortress clear. In orbit, the Ultramarine Command assessed their situation. While the ground battle had been taking place, Macragge's orbital space defenses had been crippled by the Tyranid fleet. Access to Macragge was open, and the Hive Fleet intensified its invasion by raining thousands upon thousands of mycetic spores directly onto the vital polar fortresses. Arriving on Octavius, Calgar took command of the surviving Imperial fleet and coordinated raids on the Tyranid vessels as they were spreading out to surround the planet. However, having delivered their cargo of spores, all the bio-vessels broke from orbit to lure Calgar's fleet away from Macragge. Calgar pursued the retreating fleet to the ringed world of Circe at the edge of the Macragge system, where both sides had planned an ambush. The Tyranids had a second fleet concealed amongst Circe's rings and sprung their trap first. However, reinforcements of over 200 Navis Imperialis warships from the Tempestus fleet dropped into real space and caught the Tyranid fleet in a pincer. In spite of this, the Tyranids retained superiority in numbers until the Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra valiantly charged into the heart of Hive Fleet Behemoth and detonated its warp drives, creating a cataclysmic vortex that sucked both it and much of the Tyranid fleet into oblivion. With the tide turned in orbit, the Imperial Navy and Ultramarine forces mopped up remaining Tyranid ships. The victory at Circe spelled the defeat of Behemoth, but it was still undecided whether Macragge would survive. Back planet side, the reinforced Tyranids threw themselves at the northern and southern polar fortresses. In the south, the defenders were slowly forced back. In the north, the Swarm Lord itself led the assault against the Grand Walls. Captain Saul Invictus, commander of the First Company, controlled the northern defenses, but the Swarm Lord managed to exploit every gap. Titans of Legio Praetor stalked the ice fields and blew massive furrows in the hordes, but eventually the defenders were pushed deeper into the fortresses. With the Tyranid fleet destroyed in space, Calgar's forces made haste back to the battlefront, where all contact had been lost with the polar fortresses. The 3rd and 7th Companies were sent ahead in their fast strike cruisers. Reaching the surface, they found scenes of unbelievable carnage. The 7th Company landed on the southern fortress and amazingly found survivors from the garrison, which included the Freeblade Auric Arachnus. Uniting together, they plunged into and cleansed the subterranean passages of the southern fortress that were overrun by Tyranids. The 3rd Company landed on the northern fortress and immediately came under attack as hundreds of Tyranid creatures poured out of the fortress's dark passages. Only the company's Devastator squads kept the swarms back until Thunderhawks arrived to blast the creatures back below ground. After the arrival of the company's 3 dreadnoughts, they pushed into the subterranean tunnels to find them littered with Tyranid and Ultramarine bodies. They burnt their way along the passages with flamers and eventually came upon the lower penetorium where the first company had made their last stand. Within the room, a circle of Terminators lay where they had fought back to back. They found the entire first company had been killed to the last man defending Macragge. With the line held, the Ultramarines liberated the planet, cleaving away the stranded Tyranid forces until they were finally eradicated from the world. The Swarm Lord was officially listed as destroyed, but no corpse was ever found. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels committed several companies to assist the understrength Ultramarines in scouring the remaining Tyranids from the planet. A sliver of Behemoth had attacked the neighboring world of Calth, spearheaded by Old One Eye, a monstrous carnifex. Although this swarm was defeated, Old One Eye would rise again decades later, and Old One Eye has since been sighted across the galaxy, most recently fighting alongside Hive Fleet Leviathan. After the battle, Chaplain Orton Cassius, the Ultramarines' Master of Sanctity, who had accompanied the Third Company in their desperate fight to relieve the First, asked for and received permission from Calgar to create a special unit of Tyrannic War veterans, which have grown steadily over the years in both numbers and experience, as the Imperium continues to clash with the Hive Fleets. Thus concluded the First Tyrannic War. With the main Tyranid assault repelled, Imperial forces now had the resources, numbers, and intelligence needed to counterattack Behemoth, and began slowly pushing them out of Ultramar. Meanwhile, although Behemoth's threat to the galaxy had ended, the hive mind had sampled a significant amount of new biomass and gained experience of how the galaxy's defenders tactically operate. It would also be years before its creatures were scoured from Macragge and before the Ultramarines and Ultramar could replace all their losses. In the end, the First Contact War had been a great period of learning for both sides. The Imperium learned of the grave Xenos threat, its connection to the Gene Stealers, its unique biology, and its hunger for biomass. Conversely, the Tyranids had learned of the major races of the galaxy, both biologically and politically. It also learned of the threat of the warp and the unique adaptations needed to be taken to win in this new realm. Needless to say, the hive mind would never again let a warp-drive suicide bombing turn the tide of an invasion. After Behemoth's defeat at Macragge, the Hive Fleet splintered into smaller fragments that scattered in all directions. Since, given time to absorb fresh biomass, these splinters could grow large, the Imperium was forced to deal with plenty of fresh Tyranid threats during the following decades. Nevertheless, the Imperium declared victory and allowed itself to think that the worst of the Tyranid menace was over. Unfortunately for them, an increasing number of unique Tyranid forces began to be discovered alongside Behemoth remnants in the Eastern Fringe. Although they didn't know it, Behemoth was just the first wave of many, and these strange new Xenos were the precursors of two new Hive Fleets, Kraken and Leviathan, which would soon sink their fangs into the Milky Way. Thank you for listening to this entry from the Warhammer 40,000 Lexicanum.